Welcome, everyone. Welcome. You are listening and watching Rashkin Report. My name is Yuri Rashkin, and I am glad that you are here with us. Press like, subscribe if you haven't done it. We're here discussing kind of sometimes grim things, but I think with a smile because you got a smile in the face of all of this craziness around us. And I'm thrilled to welcome for the first time on Rashkin Report an extremely accomplished journalist and a senior fellow at Atlantic Council, Diane Francis. Diane, welcome to the program. Thank you so much for joining us.
Glad to be here.
I understand you have roots in Chicago area, and we're here just a little bit north of Chicago. And so any desire to come back to Chicagoland, or how's that?
Everybody left. I left when I was 19. I immigrated to Canada because my husband didn't want to go to Vietnam, to be blunt. He wasn't even an American, but he was an immigrant. He was from Britain, and they drafted immigrants. So they showed him the door, and he took it. I grew up in Skokie, great community. Went to one of the best high schools, maybe in the United States at that time, Niles Township High School East. 2 Nobel Prize winners, several columnists like me. Including the current Attorney General of the United States, also went to that school. So it was a very smart cohort. It was very politicized. It was very intellectual, and we had more National Merit Scholars all of my years at that school than any other high school in the United States. So it was really a lucky break for me to have had my teenage years with such stimulating colleagues.
Indeed. I'm not sure if we will get deeply into your classmates, Mr. Garland's, work, although we might. But let's first look at the topic of today's conversation, the threat that is presented to us by Russia. I enjoy reading your writings, your columns, wherever I see them, in The Hill or Substack or wherever. And I really appreciate the sober view of Russia that you have. It's what I used to find in common with the Republican Party, because I am not the most conservative person out there, but I would always look at the Republican Party and say, yes, Russia is a threat. We can agree on that. That is a danger. And now it has changed somewhat. So I appreciate, well, somewhat is a lightly put. So I really appreciate your writings. Why do you feel the threat is there? Can you talk about why do you feel it is important to have such a, well, maybe negative or maybe realistic view of Russia and of Putin's regime?
Well, I grew up in the U.S. during the Cold War, and Russia was the enemy. It was America versus Russia. That was the Cold War. And Russia was, had imprisoned half of Europe and other countries and was creating trouble all over the place with its communist ideology. And I grew up, it was the bad guy, and it still is. I don't think it stopped being the bad guy, because they went straight from, Gorbachev, who wasn't that effective in fixing things, but got everything to change, the leadership to change almost directly, to Putin, with a couple of years in the middle by Yeltsin, who was drunk the whole time. So you've got, I interviewed him. You've got a place. It's the only European empire that remains intact, and they want to increase it in size. And Mr. Putin is a very malevolent character in history.
Yeah, I've listened to another interview that you gave where you told the story of your attempt to interview Boris Yeltsin. It's admirable, but if the man is going to face plant into his eggs, what are you going to do?
Well, I just looked at his aide and I said, is he having a heart attack? Is he sick? And he said, no. And I said, is he going to get up, and is he drunk? And he said, yep. And I said, well, I'm over then. I can't get a word of interview out of him. So that's it. I'm leaving. So I just got up and left.
Somehow it seems like it should have been a scene in the movie, just that kind of like a reporter trying to communicate with him. But nonetheless, Russia so many people have tried and tried to make economic prosperity for Russians, and it led into just war and destruction. What do you think is a more appropriate way of dealing with Russia going forward?
Well, Putin has to be defeated. There has to be regime change. That has to be the goal. That should be the Western goal, as well as, obviously saving poor Ukraine from being the next chess piece he wants to swipe off the table. This guy is not going to stop. And, what's kind of interesting is that it's a gigantic country. It's the biggest country in 11 time zones. It has 140 odd million people, but it has, maybe nearly 200 ethnic groups living there. And the country is an empire that's controlled by white Russians in Moscow and St. Petersburg. They control the whole thing. That's where they live. They talk to each other. They have the best lives ever. And the rest of the country lives like a third world nation. It's really quite unbelievable. And they've created a military dictatorship that keeps the oppressed people in their place. And they can do whatever they want. And he has taken it over. He has this crazy sense of mission. It's not just about Ukraine. He wants Europe. He wants to conquer the world, and he wants to destroy the West. So, this is a man with frightening ambitions.
How do you see relationship between Vladimir Putin and NATO? Do you feel that he is scared of it or not? Because if he is to have a world war or war against everybody, that means war against NATO. But so far, it seems like one thing he's not attacking is NATO countries.
He's not attacking NATO countries because if he did and NATO declared war, he would lose that war. The combined economic output of NATO is something like 25 times more than the Russian economy. The number of soldiers, the weaponry, the technology. No, he doesn't dare. But what he's doing is he is, chipping away at it. He is trying to divide it. He has his little people inside Europe, inside NATO, trying to cause trouble, like Orban in Hungary or Le Pen in France. And, he's chipping away, and he was able to get Britain to leave the European Union, which was something that he campaigned very hard for, and he helped get Trump elected. And Trump is an isolationist whose attitude is, as we know. Well, he wouldn't have invaded if I'd been a boss, because he would have been frightened of me. I don't believe that's true. But he also says, NATO's got to pull its weight. And he was right on that, and NATO is starting to. The NATO nations are starting to pull up their bootstraps. But at the end of the day, this is where we're at. This man is, if he gets Ukraine, even if say he agrees to stop where he is, then there'll be another invasion when the time is right. He'll take the rest of Georgia. He'll go for Moldova. He might grab a Baltic state. And it doesn't stop.
When you say regime change, that's a very intriguing proposition, because how do you see this regime change taking place? If you could run through different options.
Well, the power structure in Russia is the following. You have a military dictatorship headed by virtually a king, a czar, and that's Putin. He has unlimited power, and he has power over the people beneath him. That includes the military, that includes the Siloviki, which is the technocrats, who are many of his friends, who run the day-to-day affairs of the government, but do everything he tells them to do. Then beneath that, you have the oligarchs, who don't have actual genuine power, but he's made them all rich. And when he says jump, they say, how high, Vlad? He controls them, and he controls that entire mechanism and a very large military machine. So, you got to get rid of, you got to take the head off the top. You've got to get rid of Putin, or have him whatever, And if Putin goes, then there'll be a bit of a mess, and maybe I would like it to fall apart. I would like Russia to fall apart in about 10 pieces. That would be great.
I think it's a beautiful dream. And I think perhaps that's the beautiful Russia of tomorrow or future. But nonetheless, do you see this as happening, something that can happen by Russians' hands? Or is this regime change that perhaps involves some military from outside doing some regime changing?
I think that he has to be weak. And first of all, he's not going to live forever. I think he's in his 70s. And there's rumors about his health, but I wouldn't count on that. The point is, he's not going to be around forever. But while he is around, he will stay in power. And what the West has to do, NATO and Ukraine is doing, is throw everything they can at it. Everything. And that means, I really believe that they should start to recruit a mercenary army of Europeans and others who want to go to Ukraine and help them. You could probably raise an army of 250,000 people, and you pay them, and they'd go there. It wouldn't be NATO paying them. It would be, I don't know what it would be. It would be some kind of volunteer expeditionary force. I think that, obviously the weapons delays have been disastrous for Ukrainians. That has to be expedited and enlarged. Ukraine needs, 400 airplanes. With 400 airplanes, Putin has problems holding the front line. With a lot more ground troops, he has problems. And so you just have to keep chipping away at him, costing him money. You have to bust up the sanctions busters. The sanctions are not working. India and China must be told in no uncertain terms that, okay, you want to buy oil from Russia, you're going to pay us a tax for doing that. And you've got to get other supplies from elsewhere because you are an accessory to this. And so there has to be much more tough stuff undertaken. The confiscated financial assets have to be, the frozen assets have to be confiscated and given to Ukraine.
I agree with everything except that I think there was a recent news that India is now saying that they're not going to accept Russian ships in their ports, so that shadow fleet that was floating is out there in the shadows. But it sounds like sanctions are kind of are doing some damage.
There's huge pressure. India is more susceptible to pressure than China is by the West, because India wants to pick up where China's left off. China has huge economic troubles, huge. I've written a lot about that in my newsletter. They're in real trouble, China. And so, the people are moving factories from China to India or to Mexico or back home. And so India is the darling of the West, and India is going to have to start to play ball better with us, and that's just a start. The banks in China are also facing a huge problem as a result of additional sanctions. But every Russian oligarch in the world, and his family and his companies, all their assets should be seized worldwide.
What about
no court case? Just seize them. That would help.
It certainly would. But what about, at what point do you end diplomatic relations with Russia at that point? At what point do you declare Russia a terrorist state? Where does it need to stop? Are we really heading to the world war as it is? It's just slower.
It's going to end up being in the same category as North Korea and Iran. They're pariah states. They're isolated. They have no prospects going forward. And, it's just, you can't go around, murdering people and invading countries. You can't do that. And we know that he was behind the attack in Israel on behalf of Hamas. He's behind just about everything. He's causing trouble in Venezuela. I'm sure he's behind a lot of the smuggling across the U.S. southern border. It's already a world war, but it's asymmetrical. We already are in World War III.
Why do you think, Diane, that the fact that the Hamas attack on the 7th of October, which is Putin's birthday,
Yes, I pointed it out. Nobody
right?
else.
Yeah, why is that not getting enough attention? Why is this not getting enough why is this not being viewed with more significance? Just some kind of like, oh, what an interesting coincidence, or well, maybe they wanted to do something nice for their, Lord Voldemort. But isn't there some significant? I mean, is it just beyond well wishes?
It's very significant. So is the fact that the Hamas leadership, 3 days after that attack, that genocidal attack on Israel, were partying in Moscow. They were being congratulated in Moscow. And then the fact is that, the Ukrainian intelligence tipped off Netanyahu 2 weeks before that the Wagner group, the mercenaries, Putin's mercenary, were training terrorists to attack Israel shortly. He ignored it. So, all these things, it's just so obvious to me. Now, what's really interesting is the terrorist attack in Moscow. And I wrote about that yesterday. And that I call that, I gave it the headline, Russia Unravels. Russia has millions of secular Muslim people living in its poorest provinces who are mistreated, abused, overlooked, have been occupied by Moscow for ages. And it's their sons that are getting inducted and going into the conscription. Their sons are disproportionately getting killed in Ukraine. The kids in Moscow and St. Petersburg, they're not getting drafted, but the Turkic kids in Chechnya and Tatarstan. So the biggest anti-war protest in Russia took place in January in Bashkortostan. I also wrote about that. There's a picture in my newsletter. It was an enormous crowd. This has got to be worrisome. These people have they have majorities in their areas. They're rich areas. Their incomes are dreadful, and they're gonna someday want to be independent, and they're gonna want to get out from under this. And so to have a Islamist terrorist group blow up the shopping mall and the theater in Moscow, right close to the Kremlin, because they regard, Russia as murderers of the Muslims in the Middle East and in Afghanistan and all over the place, is to me a very clear indication that this country is not going to hold together.
I think you make a very good point. And to me, the death of Navalny showed that possibility of peaceful transfer of power in Russia. That idea is dead, like Alexei Navalny. And so this explosion of this terrorist attack is showing both the tension and perhaps the way forward. Because when you say that Russia should fall apart into perhaps 10 different little pieces, smaller pieces, this is how it's going to get there, isn't it?
That's what happened in 1991. The Soviet Union was almost twice the size of what the Russian Federation is now, and it fell apart. 15 republics left the thing, and the Russian Federation was left behind. So it's like a Matryoshka doll.
But doesn't it require the leader to be in a weak spot? Because Gorbachev was really weak after that failed coup attempt, and he was almost a lame duck. And then, Yeltsin looking good. Russia doesn't have any of that, right? Today's Russia doesn't have any of that. It just has Vladimir Putin.
Until it doesn't.
But then there will be probably somebody from FSB who will come in their place, don't you think?
I don't think so. I think if the center doesn't hold and you don't have a ruthless military dictator like a Putin in charge, there'll be a period of interregnum, and that's when things will happen in the regions. That independence movements will now be able to go public. They will get armed. They will get support from countries that want to support them. And that's what happened in 1991. Ukraine was the first to leave the fold, and 14 others followed. Central Asia, the Baltics. And, all of that happened. So that happened in a matter of weeks. And, I just think it's when you hold together a piece of property that big with festering restive populations beneath them, suffering, I think any weaknesses will become fault lines.
It's a fascinating picture because I think it sounds like everything starts with Putin has to die.
Or leave, or whatever, or be disabled. And he's not the only regime. The regime has to change. There has to be regime change. There's a lot of people that Russians expats. I'm thinking of Kasparov and others who are still alive. Kasparov talks about how he and Khodorkovsky, the oligarch that Putin jailed, those people are putting together a shadow cabinet, a kitchen cabinet, if you like, of very intelligent, well-positioned Russian expatriates who want this to happen, who would be willing to go in and take charge or help nudge it in the right direction.
I love it. So you're talking about like externally installed government? Well, no, government of the best people that would come in and take over during that moment of uncertainty.
Yeah, maybe and maybe not, or just infiltrate and nudge it in the right direction. I don't know. I think it's a pretty top-down, elderly leadership there. There's not a lot of Gen X's in the Kremlin. So you've got a situation there too, where young people who are very westernized in Russia, they get our media, they watch our movies, they like our music. This is a demographic thing as well as an ethnic thing, and of course a political thing. So I think it's a ball game, as they say in baseball.
A friend of mine said that the only Russian opposition is Ukraine's defense, the ZSU, VSU. Ukraine is the only opposition to Putin. But so I guess let's transition to how you see Ukraine holding out, because we are in this perennial waiting game, it seems. It seems like, a Republican Party may be willing to sacrifice a speaker to avoid holding a vote on Ukraine. What kind of impact do you see it is having? Because I know you have roots, you have connections to Ukraine. What are you hearing, and what impact do you feel this inaction by Congress is having on real battlefield?
Well, the U.S. is the Republican Party is a huge disappointment. It's pretty shocking that they adhere to the whims of a Mr. Trump, who has absolutely no foreign policy chops or historical perspective as to what's going on in the world. This guy is a smash and grab artist, a crooked wheeler dealer from New York who was a punchline and got lucky and became president. And he's really good at wielding power, and he knows how to intimidate people. So it's a reign of terror already in the Republican Party ranks. And that's, that's totally undemocratic and really quite shocking, and horribly dysfunctional. I think they'll get through it because the polling shows among Americans that there's support for Ukraine, and there certainly is no support for Putin. And so there's that. But the really good news is that, and it's sort of the default of Mr. Trump, and that is that the Europeans are getting their act together. They are really getting their act together because they are staring at the possibility the Americans will not continue, that Biden won't win the election, that the Republicans will continue to play games and hold it hostage. And so they're next, and they've got to start to do what the Americans did. And that's pony up another $60 billion in military aid a year, in addition to the 50 they're giving for government and financial aid. They are very rich. they like their cafes, their lattes, their leisure, their lovely, gentle European way of life, but they're going to have to get real. And they know it. And Macron has broken the ranks, and that's going to forever change Europe, because he's now making a power play to replace Germany as the big boy. He's the only nuclear power in Europe, in Europe, in the European Union, not in NATO. There's Britain too. He is the only European country that has a permanent seat on the UN Security Council. So he is assuming the status that he should have a long time ago. Germany is not going to get its act together. It's so tortured by what it did in the past. Poland is the moral voice of Europe, and it's been nudging and working very closely, along with the Czech Republic, on Macron. And so I see that as making a big difference.
A couple of questions out of that. First of all, well, is there a number that you feel needs to be provided for Ukraine that you have in mind? Because we are talking about this 95 with a 60, $95 billion help period, but that's for Israel and Taiwan and Ukraine. And of that 60 billion roughly for Ukraine, is there a number that you have in mind that you feel would be a more appropriate number?
Well, they need 60 billion plus. And then the Europeans have to do more on the military side, which they're starting to do. Now, they have given us more money. Europe has given more money to Ukraine than the Americans. The Americans is almost principally military aid. But the Europeans are paying for the schools to run and the lights to stay on, and, the cost of government and all of that. And so, that is, they're just going to have to pony up more. That's all. And, this really isn't a large price to pay. One attack on NATO and, the world quickly unravels.
Let's see. What about Macron? So when you mention Macron, I think people's ears kind of perk up, because that was a strong statement that he's made. France's military in Ukraine, isn't he still member of NATO? How is this all going to work out? Is the United States being dragged into a war now? Is he being under local political pressure to make these statements? Or are you just seeing the fact that we are finally seeing a European leader take a step forward for whatever reason?
Well, I think he's just being pragmatic and realistic. The Poles have been saying this sort of thing for a long time. Eastern and Central Europe, with the exception of Hungary, are terrified. They're terrified. And that's why Finland and Sweden joined NATO. They're terrified. They know what's going to happen, and they've dealt with this customer before. So they know how ruthless and brutal the Russians can be. And so, I think it's just they're finally waking up to the fact that, if there's a possibility the Americans are going to pull back or not approve help. And that's what scared them into, that's why Macron had to speak. He had to speak.
How crucial is the aid from the United States? What if the United States Congress decides to keep delaying and arguing and arguing? What do you think could happen then?
Oh, if the U.S. Delays its aid or even cuts it in half, I think that Ukraine will start to lose territory again. It'll be over.
Diane Francis, it's great to meet you and have you for for our program, for our guests. I love comments where we have a viewer says, "Such a smart woman, and she has Ukrainian roots." No, you have your Irish roots, correct?
Irish and Luxembourg, a little German. I'm an American. I got a Heinz 57, but my roots are really because I have. When I went to Toronto, Canada has the second largest Ukrainian diaspora in the world after Russia. And 15% of Canadians are Slavic. And so I got very attuned to their cultures. and what was important to them. And when the Soviet Union fell apart, I went to Ukraine first because I had a huge readership that wanted to know what was going to happen there. So I just, and I started the Chamber of Commerce between Ukraine and Canada, and I've been there dozens of times, and I did business there twice, and I've lost friends.
Diane Francis, columnist across Canada and in Kiev Post, and also on Substack and wherever else you find honest opinions. Thank you so much for joining us today. Slava Ukraini.
Right on. Thanks, Yuri.
Thank you.